For our first concept, we must specify the biological definition of a species, one which you can see in the text in front of you. For any of this to occur, some sort of reproductive isolation or disturbance needs to happen. These ideals of reproductive disturbance could then be classified into two, allopatric and sympatric. But how exactly do they work? Well, with allopatric, the two groups tend to be split by physical means, allowing mutations over time to make them incompatible, to an extent, with that basically being it. For the far more chaotic sympatry, it's going to rely on the mechanisms of reproductive isolation to occur in the same environment. Do remember though, these are general mechanisms for allowing speciation as a whole. The mechanisms could be split into two, prezygotic and postzygotic. Here are the major mechanisms involved in prezygotic, and here are the ones in post. With habitat isolation, it's basically impossible to mate, since the habitats aren't a one-size-fits-all for organisms. In mechanical isolation, mating cannot occur, seen with things even regarding opposite directions in snail shells, preventing mating and other further complications above this. In temporal isolation, the biological cycles could affect which animals are present during the time others are, also regarding life cycle, all attributing to different interactions. In gametic isolation, the sperm is unable to reach the egg in general, or is even just fully incompatible with it. And in, of course, behavioral isolation, a more complex oddity of certain behaviors allow for speciation over time, seen in these silly dancer things. There's the type 1 compatible dancers, and there's the odd one out, unable to ever get a mate. Until he does. Now on to postzygotic. There is reduced hybrid fertility where the species can breed, but their children can't, so it doesn't fit the definition of a species. That way, seen with something like a horse and a donkey making a sterile meal. There's also hybrid breakdown, where the hybrid does survive the first generation, but over time it gets to a state of not being viable from recessive buildups. Let's not forget reduced hybrid viability, where, as the name suggests, the hybrid kinda doesn't work too well, in terms of the survival possibly not even surviving birth at all. Now hybrids aren't completely useless, they can work out, and they could possibly speciate on their own, say with something like strawberries and their polyploidy fun. The hybrids would also have to have breeding complications with the parental species though. Let's also talk about the wildcard, parapatric speciation, where they're not separated, but their center tends to have more hybridization and so. Finally, let's talk of relative speciation ideals. We have ourselves punctuated and gradual speciation. Gradual feels like a pathway, whilst punctual is more of a phylogenetic tree, suggesting to bring forth periods of mass speciations like the Cambrian explosion. One's not more right than the other, but they should be considered. There's also graphs in gene frequencies. This shows spread of certain types of genes along a spectrum, and the one more so involved with speciation is of a disruptive type, leading to two extremes possibly separating. Here are the notes on the relative specifics of the graphs. And that's really it for the majority of speciation. But remember folks, can't have speciation if they're all dead.